Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Hello and welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Anthony Green.
Green, what are you doing here?
It's election week. I'm obliged to be on every program this week.
Oh man, Annabelle Crabb already tried that. Just scram.
This week, a trade war, a possible Iran war, and in campaign news, is the Biden boom for real? We'll ask the legendary Democratic campaign manager, Bob Shrum.
Who measures up? Who can go against Trump? Right now, they think that Joe Biden can.
Also this week, the US state where gun control is a reality.
People who own guns illegally do cause most of the gun crime. There's no question about that.
And Alabama all but bans abortion after 6 weeks.
But first, the news.
The 16-month trade war between the United States and China escalated this week, with China slapping retaliatory tariffs on the US, roiling stock markets. The Dow fell almost 2.5 points on Monday on news China would slap 25% levies on a range of imported US goods worth around $60 billion. But then, markets suddenly snapped back.
The Dow soaring about 350 points at the highs of the day after yesterday's steep sell-off. This all after President Trump said the trade war is really just a little squabble.
The volatility came after the US pushed ahead with a tariff hike from 10 to 25% on around $200 billion worth of Chinese imports, and despite this warning from President Trump.
China should not retaliate, will only get worse.
And by get worse, he means increasing tariffs on another $300 billion worth of other Chinese imports and declaring a national emergency, banning US companies doing business with telcos owned by foreign governments. He means you, Huawei. Still, the president hailed what he sees as the positive economic impact of tariffs.
In 1 year, tariffs have rebuilt our steel industry. It is booming.
Farming states are taking a hit. President Trump reportedly planning to provide another $15 billion worth of financial aid to farmers losing exports to China. That will potentially be funded by tariffs paid by American consumers to the American government when they buy Chinese products. And as far as the president is concerned, it is win-win for America.
Our great patriot farmers will be one of the biggest beneficiaries of what is happening now.
Yeah, that soybean procurement program that Trump's talking about is interesting to me, John, especially given that in 2013, China completely phased out procurement programs for soybeans. In other words, Trump is now more protectionist than China is. But broadly speaking, there is a certain logic to Trump's actions. Now, unlike what Trump pretends Americans are suffering during this trade war, the prices of tariff-affected goods have definitely gone up since Trump's tariffs were imposed, especially in comparison to all the other goods. So the tariffs are effectively a tax on consumers. And according to Oxford Economics, if Trump and China go all the way with their tariffs, it could cost America 0.5% of GDP growth next year, not to mention costing the world 0.5% of GDP growth. But here is where Trump's logic kicks in, because it could cost China 1.3% of GDP growth. So why is that? It's because China exports a lot more to America than America does to China. In fact, generally speaking, America is less dependent on trade than almost any other country. America's exports are worth 12% of GDP and its imports are worth 15% of GDP, whereas China is more dependent on trade. Australia, by the way, is also more dependent on trade, and Europe is way more dependent on trade. But focusing on China, when their US exports drop, and their US exports are dropping a lot since the tariffs kicked in, it hurts them more than it hurts America. And China's more vulnerable to economic pain as well. Because while it's true that China doesn't have to worry about elections, China's growth rate has been dropping for over a decade. Last quarter's GDP growth was the lowest since 1990. So it's not a bad gamble from Trump that he can make China hurt bad. The question is China ever going to fold? And will American farmers stick with Trump until then? Republican Senator Tom Cotton came up with a good reason why they should.
There will be some sacrifice on the part of Americans, I grant you that. But I also would say that sacrifice is pretty minimal compared to the sacrifices that our soldiers make overseas, that our fallen heroes who are laid to rest in Arlington make.
Spot on. The pain of tariffs is nothing compared to the pain of being shot dead. Thanks for the perspective, Tom.
A perspective informed somewhat by the fact he's just written a book about Arlington, so nice plug, Tom. The Republican governor of Alabama, Kate Ivey, has signed the most restrictive abortion law in the United States.
Essentially banning abortion at all stages. Doctors could face up to 99 years in prison for performing the procedure.
When it's enacted, abortion will only be legal when it's necessary to save the mother's life. Democrat Senate Minority Leader Bobby Singleton expressed his outrage when Republicans stripped away exemptions for victims of rape or incest.
Heck no! He didn't even make a motion. He did not make a motion.
He made a motion to table.
What was the motion made?
The law takes effect in 6 months, and it sets up a legal fight that could lead to the overturning of the landmark Roe v. Wade Supreme Court ruling of 1973. A total of 16 Republican-dominated states have now passed or are working to pass abortion restrictions from 6 weeks of pregnancy, when a fetal heartbeat can first be detected, and before many women, of course, even know they're pregnant.
And look, I understand, John, the pro-life logic of saying all fetuses are human lives, therefore it's murder, so therefore even when the mother has been raped, that's still murder if you kill the fetus.
That's the logic.
I understand the logic, but there's still some hypocrisy in this bill. Because, for instance, they regard in this bill a fertilised egg as a human life. If you destroy the fertilised egg, that is murder. But only when it's in a womb. Only when it's in a woman. A fertilised egg in an IVF clinic is not a human. Doesn't matter what you do with it. So there's a bit of hypocrisy there. But the thing which I find strangest about the entire abortion situation in America at the moment, not just this state, is America is split into two. As you just said, you've got the best part of half the states in America passing laws like this that are damn close to outlawing abortion completely if Roe versus Wade is overturned. The other half of America, though, is passing laws that are the direct opposite, abortion on demand, basically. Right. And neither of those positions is popular. Both those positions only have about 15 to 20% support, if you look at the polls.
Yep.
The vast majority of people are in between that, but they're being represented by no states. It's complete dysfunction of democracy.
Yeah, really emblematic of the polarisation of politics. And how that's affecting the fact that 5 years ago there was kind of consensus around 20 weeks being a reasonable cut-off point for abortion, and now we've gotten to this rather polarised stage. But as for how extreme this law is, here is the Reverend Pat Robertson, best known for declaring a number of natural disasters were caused by gay people and that Haitians had made a pact with the devil, which is why they had an earthquake. So what does Pat think of this law?
It's an extreme law, and they want to challenge Roe versus Wade, but my humble view is that this is not the case we want to bring to the Supreme Court, because I think this one will lose.
You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I think Pat Robertson is right.
Wow.
in that the Supreme Court at the moment, Justice Roberts is basically the swinging judge. And he's gone out of his way as an institutionalist to not have really obvious overturns of precedent, like for instance with Obamacare. He went out of his way to find a middle ground. And I feel like he probably wants to get rid of Roe versus Wade, but he'd want to do it in little bits and pieces, so it's not in a big way. Now, if this is the case, that's overturning Roe versus Wade completely in a huge way, and I'm not sure John Roberts would want to do that.
Yeah, but even if the Alabama law doesn't get through the federal court system to the Supreme Court, then maybe we're going to see one of these other state laws challenged that far. Either way, it's going to be an issue in 2020, and Donald Trump wants that to shore up his base. But speaking of 2020...
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
To the polls, former Vice President Joe Biden is sitting on just under 40% this week in the Real Clear Politics average. That is more than 23 points ahead now of independent Senator Bernie Sanders. It is a tight race for third between Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. Beto O'Rourke is sitting on just over 4 points, Cory Booker on 2 and a little bit, and then comes Amy Klobuchar and Julian Castro as the only other candidates averaging 1% or better. The rest are nowhere. Meanwhile, A series of head-to-head polls this week from Emerson had 5 Democrats beating President Trump. Biden and Sanders do best, leading by 8 points nationally. Next comes Beto O'Rourke with a 4-point lead, Warren 3, Harris 2, and Pete Buttigieg is tied with President Donald Trump.
You know, Biden isn't only ahead in the polls, though. If you look at the cable news coverage, Biden is also dominating with about 3 times as many mentions as Bernie Sanders and 5 times as many mentions as anyone else. Biden's definitely the front runner, but it might be closer than it seems. YouGov asked Democrats recently who they were considering supporting if they could nominate more than one person, and Biden was out in front again, but Sanders and Warren weren't far behind. That was 2 weeks ago. Then last week, some changes. People might notice Sanders dropping from 2nd to 4th, but he basically was on the same number. The interesting part was a big move up from Kamala Harris and a big move down from Beto O'Rourke. And there's still that bunch of 4 just behind Biden. A lot can happen, yeah.
Call that a poll? That's amateur hour stuff. You don't even know what booth it's from.
Piss off, Green!
Speaking about Sanders, he got himself into a little bit of a twist this week. Bearing in mind he's been working hard to win the black vote, this wasn't super well received.
Cory Booker says he will name a woman as his running mate. Will you make the same pledge?
I would give very serious consideration to that.
Person of color?
I think it's premature. It would be silly to make that statement right now.
Female running mate? No problems. Person of colour? Oh, let's not be premature. But one more clip. Donald Trump this week compared Pete Buttigieg to Mad Magazine's Alfred E. Newman. Now, I don't personally see it, but Buttigieg got off a pretty effective reply, I thought.
So I'll be honest, I had to Google that. I guess it's a generational thing. I didn't get the reference. It's kind of funny, I guess, but he's also the president of the United States, and I'm surprised he's not spending more time trying to salvage this China deal.
Pretty nifty old guy jiu-jitsu there from Buttigieg.
Yeah, interesting. Trump was basically able to say that Buttigieg is unelectable because of his face, not his sexuality or his youth and inexperience. And Mayor Pete was just able to imply that Donald Trump is really, really old with cultural references stuck in the 1950s. But in fact, Chaz, this is kind of a case of life imitating art because Alfred E. Newman has run presidential campaigns as a write-in candidate ever since 1956. Have a look at this, with catchy slogans including "America is on the brink of ruin, let's finish the job," and "At least he's honest about his idiocy."
I need that guy's election shirt.
That'd be pretty good, wouldn't it?
Finally, to my policy of the week from Bernie Sanders. Bernie's partnered up with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on this bill, which proposes to cap credit card rates. Here's the deal. Americans owe over $1 trillion in credit card debt, and that leads to $113 billion a year in fees and charges. We're talking a median credit card interest rate here of 21.36%, or about 25% if you've got a poor credit score. Payday loans, they're even worse. Way worse. So what Sanders is proposing is a compulsory cap on interest rates of 15% per annum. Now that sounds nice.
Sure.
But it would obviously mean the end of the payday lending industry.
What a shame.
I know no one's going to cry for them, but the question is, where do poor people go for loans? Other than, say, pawning off grandma's jewellery.
Oh, go to a bank?
Well, they've got poor credit risks.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, Sanders suggests that the Postal Service should get back into banking and small loans, and that would fill the gap. May or may not be a good idea. I would just say this. Overdraft fees and bounce checks, they cost even more than payday loans do. So Sanders is going to have to make sure he gets the details right here, or he could screw over his own supporters. Having said that, this policy polls like a dream. 68% of people support the idea, including nearly 70% of Republican primary voters.
It's almost like they need to, I don't know, regulate the banks a little bit more.
Almost.
Maybe. Okay, so we've seen this week that Mayor Pete Buttigieg is getting a lot of notice, as are the top tier of candidates. But for the likes of Tulsi Gabbard, Kirsten Gillibrand, John Delaney, John who, should they just pack it in and go home? Or is there still the potential to emerge from this very crowded Democratic presidential field? Well, there is, in my view, nobody better qualified to talk about Democratic presidential politics than Robert Shrum. He worked on presidential campaigns campaigns from McGovern in '72 to John Kerry in 2004. These days, he's head of the Institute of Politics at the University of Southern California. Bob Shrum, welcome back to Planet America.
Happy to be here from the other side of the Pacific.
Bob, we saw Montana's Steve Bullock get into the race this week. Why would anyone want to become the 23rd Democrat running for president?
Well, he wants to be president, and he thinks in this great big field, lightning might strike. His message is that he can appeal to Trump voters, that he's been a successful Democratic governor and attorney general in a very red state. I don't think he's the big story of the week, but he's certainly the most recent one.
There has never been a primary field this large before. What impact is it going to have?
Well, it's going to be a little odd in the debates because even if you divide it into two debates, which the Democrats are doing for the first series of debates, so that you have 10 candidates or 11 candidates in each debate, if they're 90 minutes long, each candidate's going to get about 6 or 7 minutes when you allow time for introductions and questions. So they're going to be a little odd, these debates. But it is also possible that this field will not fragment in quite the way people were anticipating a month ago, and that the process may not go on as long as people were anticipating. I say that because Vice President Biden was tremendously underestimated before he announced. Since he's announced, he has opened up big leads in the polls. He faces some real tests ahead. The debates are one. Another is, will he make a mistake? But the one thing I believe is not going to happen in the Democratic Party is they're not going to have an ideological derby. It's not going to be an identity politics litmus test. The predominant question, and I've been saying this for months, is going to be who has the best chance to beat Trump. And that's why, for example, if you look at the polling in South Carolina right now, even with African American candidates in the field, Joe Biden is getting 54% of the African American vote. Now, he'll hit a down period. Every successful candidate for the nomination does. Clinton did, Kerry did, Gore did, but they came back. But it's also possible that Biden could do very well early on, and that this might not be the kind of prolonged contest people think it's going to be.
Bob, you know that being a front runner is no guarantee. In 1971, you were working for Ed Muskie when he was the favourite to beat Richard Nixon.
Well, Muskie was a very flawed candidate. I mean, he was a terrific human being. He was a great senator. He had a lot of trouble clarifying his position on the Vietnam War. So he fell to George McGovern. It was probably predictable, but no one predicted it. I think it's more likely this time that you will either see Vice President Biden do very, very well, or he will make a mistake, or he will not do well in the debates. And then some of the other candidates who are sitting there at 5, 6, 11, 12% are going to move up. And you could get a nominee who's not the front runner. But I would not assume the front runner will fall. Look, if you look at the Democratic field, the front runner has won in the nomination in '92, in 2000, in 2004, not in 2008, but again in 2016. So I don't think that for all of the talk about how liberal people are going to be, how far to the left they're going to be pushed, that's not what's on the minds of Democratic primary voters. The Twitter universe of people who are commenting on this race is not the same as the folks who are going to go to caucuses and primaries and decide who's going to be the nominee.
While we're comparing this campaign to 1972, when progressive George McGovern was nominated that year, it split the Democratic Party and you lost. Would a Bernie Sanders nomination do that next year?
I think if Bernie Sanders were the nominee, Democrats, for the most part, would unite behind him because there's such a strong desire to beat Trump. It is really powerful. It is the driving force inside the party. If you look at our USC LA Times Dornsife polling, and I help run that as the director of the Center for the Political Future at the University of Southern California, I'm beginning to think that Sanders has a kind of ceiling. He has a hard core of supporters, but he would probably find it very difficult to get to 35, 40% of the vote. So I think that Elizabeth Warren is more likely from that wing of the party to break out than Bernie Sanders is.
And as I recall, Bob, we heard a lot of talk about the ceiling in Donald Trump's support in 2015 and 2016. So why do you think that Bernie Sanders can't get enough support for the nomination in this big field?
The way the process works, it's going to be very difficult. We don't have winner take all in the Democratic Party. We have it in the Republican Party in this country in the primaries. So if you're just getting 35% of the vote, someone else is getting 30, someone else getting 20 or 15, then you're going to divide up the delegates. So it's very hard to get to a majority of the delegates. Ultimately, you're going to have to get to that 50% threshold or close to it to be the nominee. The process in California, for example, people talk about California could be decisive. It's got the most delegates, it's moved up. Well, the fact of the matter is that if someone comes out here, gets, say, 34% of the vote in California, somebody else gets 28%, they're going to get about the same number of delegates.
Another early favourite, Beto O'Rourke, is struggling to break through into the top tier in the polls. What do you think's happened to him?
What happened to him was he entered with a huge splash, but the water receded. To some extent, that's natural, and he may very well come back. He's doing a lot of things that he should be doing if he wants to come from the position he's at to win the nomination. He's visiting Iowa constantly. He's in a lot of small towns. He's in the big cities in Iowa, if you can call them big cities. He's spending a lot of time in New Hampshire. Somebody has to break through in those early primaries. If you don't have a Beto O'Rourke or a Pete Buttigieg or a Kamala Harris break through in Iowa and New Hampshire, then by the time you get to South Carolina and Nevada, I think you're going to see someone like Biden, if he's the person who's done very well in those first two primaries, he's going to do very well in South Carolina. And at that point, you could have a repetition of what happened in 2000, where Al Gore won every single caucus and primary. I don't think that will occur, but it could occur.
Right now, of course, there are only 9 candidates above 1% in the polls. Should the rest of them just give it up? Is there any point in them even running?
Well, Jimmy Carter was, way down in the polls, 2 or 3% in 1976. George McGovern was way down in the polls at the beginning in 1972. And people look at the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and they say, well, anything can happen. So there's no reason for them not to run.
The last time the Democrats tried to beat an incumbent Republican president, you were the one running John Kerry's campaign. You came close in 2004. So what is your advice on taking on President Trump next year?
First of all, they got to have a strong economic message. One of Hillary Clinton's mistakes was she didn't have a strong economic message. In fact, she hardly had one at all. There's an estimate by a political scientist at UCLA that only 9% of her television advertising ever mentioned jobs, and that was often in the context of alternative energy. So you got to have a strong economic message, number one. Number two, you got to be able to stand up to Trump in those debates. And I think if you practice and do your homework, you can actually be very effective against him. I mean, when he invaded Hillary Clinton's space, you almost wish she had turned around and said, "What are you doing? Go back to your podium." So I think you get ready for the debates, you get ready to take him on. The one thing you don't do is just run a total negative campaign against Trump. Most of the bad things about him are known. People have taken them on board. You can't just keep banging that drum, which is what the Clinton campaign did, and not give people a sense that you care about them, that you've got a real economic plan to deal with their problems, that you're going to really address the health care issues, which are still nagging in this country. Health care is a predominant issue among Democratic primary voters and a big issue among voters in general. So that's what you've got to do. And you got to put it all together in a message that people can understand. Trump, in my view, was completely wrong about trade, wrong about immigration, but he said to people, look, your problems are all traceable to those two things, and I'm going to make America great again. Clinton's slogan, on the other hand, was stronger together, which was more a negative critique of Trump than it was an indication of what she was going to do as president.
Bob Shrum, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
The president's son, Donald Trump Jr., has agreed to appear before the Senate Intelligence Committee next month to answer more questions about his contacts with Russians, including that June 2016 Trump Tower meeting. Trump Jr., who, like his father, refused an interview with Special Counsel Robert Mueller, was subpoenaed by committee chair, Republican Senator Richard Burr, after resisting earlier requests for a voluntary appearance. That subpoena has triggered an angry response from the White House and opened a rift in the Republicans' Senate ranks. Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Lindsey Graham, another Republican, took the extraordinary step this week of advising Trump Jr. to ignore the subpoena.
And if I were Donald Trump Jr.'s lawyer, I would tell him, you don't need to go back into this environment anymore. You've been there for hours and hours and hours, and nothing being alleged here changes the outcome of the Mueller investigation. I would call it a day.
That's the chair of the Judiciary Committee telling Don Jr. to break the law.
I know. And then Lindsey Graham advised Don Jr. just plead the fifth, remain silent, avoid self-incrimination.
Well, at least that's not against the law.
At the very least. Well, Don Jr. has given more than 20 hours of congressional testimony, but now the Mueller report is out, senators want to hear about his earlier claims to them under oath that he knew nothing about Trump Sr.'s plans to build Trump Tower Moscow. Meanwhile, it is fair to say that it has been an extraordinary evolution for Lindsey Graham. Remember how he described Donald Trump back in 2015?
I think he's a kook. I think he's crazy. I think he's unfit for office.
But now they're golf buddies. It's been a big 4 years.
Cory Booker put out his gun control policy last week and it was pretty strict. Some of his proposals include an assault weapons ban, a restriction on high-capacity magazines, universal background checks, a gun database, and a requirement for people to get a permit before they can own a gun. Now, some may have trouble imagining these kinds of laws in America, but they don't have to imagine them because they exist in Massachusetts. Those laws have been in effect for years. So, do they work? And how have they affected people's Second Amendment rights? With us now is the Chief of the Norwood, Massachusetts Police Department, William Brooks. Chief, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
What does one need to do to get a gun license in Massachusetts?
Well, the way the system is in our state, an applicant would need to go to his local police station and make an application. Those people provide some information to the police department. They're fingerprinted and photographed. And then during about a 40-day window, the police department runs a series of checks. It's actually run through a state system that oversees the firearms laws in our state. And they check for, as you can imagine, whether the person is what his criminal record is, if he's been convicted of a crime, if he has been committed for mental health, if he's got a restraining order against him, that sort of thing. And then if the state approves all of that, the information is sent back to us. The police chief can take a look at all of that information and decide whether or not to issue the license.
When people say the Supreme Court has found that I have a constitutional right to own a gun and you shouldn't be able to stop me enjoying my constitutional rights based on a judgment call, what do you say to that?
Well, it's like any other constitutional right here. You know, they're not unlimited. So the case says, you know, you have a right to free speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. You know, the Supreme Court has recognized that although people have the right to possess a firearm primarily to defend their home, that's not an unfettered right, and that the government can place reasonable limitations on that right.
To universal background checks now. How does a parent give a family gun to their child in Massachusetts?
There's actually a couple of systems in Massachusetts that have been put together to manage this, and the transfer between private parties of firearms is just called the Massachusetts Gun Portal. And you log in and you put in your license to carry information and the serial number and the type of weapon that you look to transfer. And then you enter the information on the person who is receiving the firearm. And that system logs who owns the firearm and where it is. So that's what we do here in Massachusetts to document the movement of firearms from one individual to another.
Do you find that Massachusetts citizens tend to comply with these kinds of stricter gun laws?
I do, I really do. The vast majority of applicants that I receive are from law-abiding residents who live in the town, and they typically either want to go to the firing range and practice and shoot as a sport, or they have some concerns about home security, and they want to have a firearm in their home. And then there's probably a small number who think that their occupations are such that they're placed at some risk. Maybe they own a business and they carry a large amount of cash or something like that. And so they come into the police station, they make their application, they pay their fee, they go through the process. And really 98%, we've actually looked at these numbers, 98% of the people who apply for gun licenses qualify for them. And the vast majority of gun owners are law-abiding citizens who have done nothing wrong. And they comply with the law and we have no problem with them.
Countries like Canada have had gun databases before as well, and they found that maintaining them was quite costly. They thought it wasn't worth it. So what do you feel the Massachusetts gun database achieves?
You know, most people who own a firearm and who are law-abiding and may have 3 or 4 firearms and those firearms are registered, and then something happens 3 or 4 years down the road where those firearms need to be taken from them. Let's say that the defendant in a restraining order, you know, 3 or 4 years ago when they were law-abiding and doing everything right, they went and registered their firearms. Now they're in the system. So if we go to serve a restraining order, we have a list of what firearms that person owns. And, you know, I must say that even in those cases, when we serve a restraining order, we say to the person, look, we're going to have to take your gun license and we've got a list of these firearms that you own and we need to take those to the police station. And we store them temporarily until the person resolves the restraining order, or maybe they say, you know, this is going to be a permanent thing and I'm going to sell my firearms, and we help facilitate that. So I think the gun portal is very, very efficient, very effective.
Chief, you just described a scenario where somewhere down the track you may need to seize someone's weapons. Now, I think there are fears in some parts of America about exactly that situation, where seizing weapons can turn violent, potentially deadly. Have you found that a problem in Massachusetts?
I've not found that a problem at all. Maybe it's the way we go about it, I don't know, but in all of my years that I've been around this type of a system, we've not had violence when we go to a home to take the weapons away. We're not doing it just based on a whim. We're doing it because there's a restraining order, there's been some criminal activity, or there's been a mental health issue. Lots of times people know we're coming, and in every case, the aggrieved party has the option to go to court and appeal what we did. And so there is recourse to the courts.
How do you respond to people who say, all these laws just make it difficult for law-abiding citizens to get guns? Meanwhile, criminals will just buy their guns illegally and they're the ones that cause all the gun crime.
People who own guns illegally do cause most of the gun crime. There's no question about that. And you know, there's a whole other set of laws around that. As far as people who are law-abiding, yes, there are some extra steps in a state like Massachusetts if you want to purchase a firearm, but I think overall those gun laws are designed for the protection of the public, and I think it gives us a leg up.
So let's talk results then. How does Massachusetts compare to the rest of America for gun suicides, gun homicides, and mass shootings?
Well, I don't know off the top of my head on mass shooting numbers. We haven't had a lot of that here. As far as general gun violence, we rank among the lowest states for rates of gun violence. There's typically several reasons why crime rates are high or low in a particular area. Obviously, one of them is access to firearms, so we have to take into account that the gun laws certainly impact that here in Massachusetts.
Given your experience with these gun control laws, are there any of them that you think would not be suitable to roll out nationwide?
If every single state took on the system that we have here in Massachusetts, quite frankly, I think it would help bring gun violence down. There's a balance here. The system that we use acknowledges and respects the right of lawful citizens, law-abiding citizens, to possess firearms. By the same token, it's pretty effective at keeping firearms out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them.
Finally, what's your message to gun rights enthusiasts who might be watching and are deeply suspicious of gun control in America?
The police that I know have no interest in infringing on anybody's rights to own a firearm, either for range practice or for home protection. Most gun owners I know, when you talk to them one-on-one, who have a firearm or have a license, they understand the system, and the system is really designed as much to protect their own rights as it is to make sure that firearms don't fall into the wrong hands. You know, every time somebody somewhere who purchased a gun legally goes out and then commits a crime and kills somebody, that has some impact on the people who possess firearms lawfully. So a system, a robust system like the one we have here in Massachusetts, I think in some way really helps preserve the rights of people who own firearms lawfully. And I think that most of the people who have gone through the system in Massachusetts and have a gun license and own firearms, I think they would tell you the same thing.
Chief William Brooks, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Nice talking to you.
There are growing concerns the sabre rattling between the United States and Iran may be actual sabre sharpening. The US has now evacuated non-essential staff from their embassy in Iraq and sent B-52 bombers and warships into the region. It seems, Chaz, as though this could be the real thing and not just some hyping fire and fury thing on Twitter.
Yeah, look, we've just passed a year since America withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, and during that period, America has been steadily increasing the sanctions pressure on Iran to the point where a few weeks ago, America even revoked waivers for Iran to ship out heavy water and enriched uranium, a move that effectively limits Iran's ability to keep to the nuclear deal. In response to that, Iran announced it would no longer try to ship heavy water or enriched uranium, which would mean that eventually Iran will be in breach of the nuclear deal. But that's still a little way off. As of February, Iran only had 125 of their allowed 130 metric tons of heavy water and 163 of their 202 allowed kilos of uranium equivalent. Meanwhile, America sent an aircraft carrier group to the Middle East ahead of schedule to warn Iran about troubling and escalatory indications of a possible Iranian attack on American forces in the region. Now, the very next day, there were leaks that these indications were overhyped. And in fact, since then, we've learnt that intelligence for that came from Israel, a country that's been agitating for regime change in Iran for some time. An Israeli official told Axios, "It is still unclear to us what the Iranians are trying to do and how they're planning to do it, but it is clear to us that the Iranian temperature is on the rise as a result of the growing US pressure campaign against them, and they're considering retaliating against US interests in the Gulf." Well, that's nice and specific. Throw that together with National Security Advisor John Bolton's long-held position on Iran.
That the declared policy of the United States of America should be the overthrow of the mullah's regime in Tehran. The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. Thank you very much.
And you can see why some were getting nervous about a move towards war. Then this weekend, a US assessment blamed Iran for damage to 4 ships near the Strait of Hormuz. And that's odd, because why would Iran try to provoke America into retaliation? Indeed, in the very same article, a US official was cited as doubting Iran was involved because of the risk of escalation with the US. Then the very same day, we learnt that America had an updated military plan to send 120,000 troops to the Middle East if Iran gave them trouble, which Trump correctly noted wasn't nearly enough troops for an invasion. But still, it didn't help. Then the British Deputy Commander of Counter-Terrorist Operations in Iraq and Syria only added to the general scepticism by saying there's been no increased threat from Iranian-backed forces in Iraq and Syria, an assessment that was immediately disowned by US Central Command. Now, John, I'm guessing that Trump's pulling the North Korea playbook out here. He's going to raise the tension to force negotiations. But we should note that this time 8 years ago, Trump did tweet that in order to get elected, Barack Obama would start a war with Iran. So what do you think?
Well, I can certainly see why, whether it was Trump then or critics of Trump now, would be worried about that kind of wag the dog scenario, that a war with Iran, or even just a limited military exchange rather than a full-scale Iraq-style invasion, is potentially going to be to Donald Trump's political advantage at home heading into a presidential re-election year. The danger, of course, is when you've got two sides that are both escalating, agitating and ultimately mobilising. Well, history tells us you get two sides mobilising even when it may just be military exercises or preparatory measures and so on. Suddenly you're creating a powder keg that anybody can throw a match into. It can get very, very risky. And if Iran's leadership are worried about the tightening vice of sanctions on them, they may actually see a way that giving America a black eye by bombing some American targets in Iraq, which is clearly one of the concerns, or American warships that are patrolling around Yemen, that then, well, what if America or Israel then decide, okay, we're going to hit one of their nuclear facilities? Again, with just an airstrike, so we're getting a bit of tit for tat going now. So again, we're not necessarily looking at kind of, storming the beaches near Tehran, but we're still looking at something that could cost a lot of lives and create a lot of instability in that region.
I should say as well, by the way, on this issue, that Trump, while America has no contact with Iran these days at all, Trump has given his phone number, apparently, according to CNN, to Switzerland, a direct line that they can then pass on to Iran to talk to him. And he said publicly, hey, call me, let's chat about this.
There's a red phone on the desk.
Exactly. So he may want to talk. I don't doubt him on that. But bluffs can, as you say, can escalate rapidly, even if they are just bluffs.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that, a couple of years ago, the State Department was looking at the fire and fury tweeting with North Korea and saying, hang on, we don't know what is going on here. The public sort of persona that Trump was putting forward and what the reality was going on at Foggy Bottom was entirely different at the time. Now there is a sense, though, that the State Department is getting onto a war footing. They're saying, hey, this is very, very real. This isn't just a rhetorical kind of a art of the deal, big, bold negotiating gambit to try and get Iran to the table and to come up with a better Iran deal or something for the future. But this is actually the kind of scenario where we could stumble into war whether we want it or not, or maybe there are people like John Bolton that actually want a war, and that is scarier still.
And let's not forget that Iran aren't exactly renowned for their cool heads either.
What could possibly go wrong? And on that note, that is it for another week.
Yep, check us out on Facebook, YouTube and iView. I will see you there.
Before we go though, Doris Day, the popular singer and actor who died this week at the age of 97. Not only was she a lifelong Republican, but a little known fact is she dated Ronald Reagan in the early 1950s when they made a couple of movies together.
Hers was the love that gave him the courage to win his greatest victories. Theirs was the unbeatable combination that made the winning team.
And it was at that time that Reagan's politics were shifting from being a union leader and an FDR New Deal progressive Democrat to becoming a staunchly anti-communist conservative. So maybe Republicans can thank Doris Day for helping in Ronald Reagan's conversion.
This guy knows everything.
Good night.
Happy voting.